Check. Yep.
Well, hello and welcome to Idiots with Instruments, the show that follows the band Red Hot Rebellion as we write and record new music and interview industry music pros in an effort to teach these old dogs new tricks. I am Jim Tramontana, bassist and lead vocalist of Red Hot Rebellion.
Hey, I'm Doug. I play guitar.
I'm Andres. I play the drums and I sing occasionally.
It's pretty badass, isn't it? So, welcome. What do you think?
Thanks.
We're gonna feel like doing a little interview?
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, let's run it right now. Joining us today is Dan Coutant, owner of Sunroom Audio, a world-class audio mastering studio located in New Windsor, New York. For over a decade, Dan has worked with bands and labels from around the world to produce amazing, polished music. His studio is purpose-built specifically for mastering and critical listening, and his focus on excellence and customer care is second to none. He's also a sorcerer of sound and a super nice fella. Dan, welcome to Idiots with Instruments. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, I am glad to talk to you because I know a lot of people, even though I've been in a band pretty much almost my entire life and have very little understanding of what mastering actually is. So I was wondering if you could explain to me and our listeners what a mastering engineer does and why it's important to use one.
Sure. I'll do my best. It's a wide open question.
Yeah, I know. Purposefully, so you can take it any direction you want.
Yeah. Well, I guess to sort of try and narrow it down a bit, I mean, in today's kind of recording world, there's a lot of folks kind of doing their own thing. And so that kind of ends up, the scenario being a band that has like sort of a Pro Tools setup at home, or the friend's basement scenario is pretty common, et cetera, so forth. And people are kind of they're winging it a little bit. They're talented people, but maybe don't have the experience or the listening environment to really kind of nail it. Sort of get it right. And so now more than ever, mastering is sort of become a process that kind of, lends a helping hand to people that are just sort of struggling to get professional results,
Right.
So a lot of times I'll work with bands or artists that are just sort of, doing bedroom tracking, and they're doing the best they can and they're getting pretty close. And, it'll go as far as, me consulting them along the way if they're doing a recording and they're not sure about what they're getting in the initial tracking phase. They might give me a call. We might exchange some files. I might listen to some stuff and say, hey, your guitar sound is a little, has some resonance in the low mid range. That might become a problem when you start mixing, stuff like that. So
you're kind of like an ad hoc producer, kind of, right? In that sense, you're kind of producing them along the way.
I mean, yeah. I mean, this is just one facet, of the business, but it's an aspect that I see a lot is, just kind of helping folks get it right before they get the finished mixes to the mastering engineer, so that, we could actually, help them achieve a pretty professional result. Because, otherwise, I mean, there's not much of a point to going through all of that. You want to make a record on your own, but you don't want it to sound like you made a record on your own.
Right.
You want it to sound like you recorded in a studio. So mastering has almost extended into that, almost into a pre-production mode where, people are, there's been several records this year that I can remember. I mean, really talented people, excellent songwriters, really, really brilliant people. And they just don't have, the record company support or a budget to kind of make the record that they probably deserve to make. You know what I mean? And so what ends up happening is, they'll call me. I mean, it even goes as far as to, to the point of where they're asking me, hey, Dan, this is my budget. I need a microphone to record my vocals at home. What kind of microphone should I buy?
That's kind of smart. Thinking about the end product while you're actually making it versus just like giving you a bunch of crap and say, hey, Dan, fix this.
Right. Yeah. Which I, would greatly prefer, as you can imagine. I mean, I love being kind of in tune to, the origins of a recording project that is eventually going to end up here. Because, obviously, the more I can consult and sort of steer people in the right direction, the easier my job is going to be by the time I get, the finished mix files. So it's that's one aspect of it. And then, the next level up from that is just, a typical mastering session. We'll say a traditional mastering session, which is essentially, the mastering engineer gets a finished album that has been recorded and mixed. So in other words, all the instruments have been captured, vocals have been recorded and balanced, so to speak. And so you're taking these 2-track stereo files and you are trying to, number one, you're trying to not undo any good things that were done up until the point that until you got the files. And then number two, you're trying to, maybe enhance a little bit, maybe add a little bit of excitement to the recording. If it's necessary, you're doing a little bit of corrective work as well. So, if a mix or a collection of mixes may have a little bit of an inconsistency in a certain frequency range, the bass is pretty common to have sort of, some wobble and some need for some corrective work. You might just, sort of tighten that up because the fundamental thing at the heart of mastering is, you're a person who is listening to the music in an environment that is, very well tuned and that you're intimately familiar with. Like you really know, what music sounds like in this particular space. And you're just used to hearing a lot of records in through the same set of speakers in the same chair in the same environment. And, it comes to you pretty quickly what needs to kind of happen, So that's kind of, that's it in a nutshell. That's the heart and soul of the job. It's just that, taking these recordings, applying your knowledge of music, your musicality to, this group of recordings that is going to become a singular release. And you're going to make sure it's consistent. You're going to make sure, you're familiar with the genre and, sort of the benchmark of where it kind of needs to get to, play well alongside other releases in that genre or just in general, it's going to be on, a college radio show. It might be alongside a bunch of different stuff, but, you just want to make sure that it sounds like it holds its water, up against whatever else is out there. So,
and what are some, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, every mastering engineer does that a little bit differently and has a little bit of a different philosophy about, what that requires, but essentially that's what we're all doing. We're just sort of trying to meet a kind of personal benchmark, an internal benchmark for us. And that's basically what we're being paid for, is to, have good taste. So you hope that your mastering engineer has good taste.
And understands the music that you're making and
right. And
what are some best
practices
practices then for like bands to like prepare their music for a mastering engineer?
Well, it's really just comes down to, making your recording sound as good as you possibly can. And sticking with your vision for the recording. The mastering engineer really shouldn't come in at the end and kind of reinvent anything, so to speak. You really just, there's lots of technical rules and things, and people ask questions all the time. How loud should my mix be? Should I put compression on my mix? Should I EQ my mix? And, it really, it's all over the map. There really isn't any set of specific rules. It's just, fundamentally, I just always try and tell people, if you have a lot of experience with, what you're doing, and this is kind of your thing, this is the way, as an artist, you approach, preparing a mix or preparing a recording for the mastering phase, then just do your thing. If you know what you're doing, I'm going to be fine. I really don't have any specific rules except, just don't blow it up and then send it to me.
Right, and say, unblow
and then expect
this.
it, yeah, expect it to be, reassembled, so to speak. It's
right.
That's basically my rule of thumb is what I tell people, should I do this? Should I do that? It's really up to them. Unless they're not sure, they're just doing it because they think that's what you're supposed to do. And then, but they really don't have any control over what it is they're doing. So try and discourage that. And if people are unsure, again, I do a whole lot of listening to stuff before I ever start working on it and sort of consulting and, just saying, a little move here, a little move there, up or down, left or right, whatever, we're going to be in the ballpark. We're going to be good, ready to finish it off. So, a lot of that kind of stuff goes on a regular basis. And yeah, it's an important part of the job. Right. And it's great that people kind of trust you to, sort of lead them down the right road.
Because you're the guy like putting the final polish before it goes out into the world. So you got like kind of a lot of responsibility, but at the same time, if they give you crap, you can't polish a turd, right? So yeah, I mean, there are expectations sometimes that you hate really to in a service-based industry and a very competitive industry where you want to be able to do anything that is asked of you to do. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to say no or to tell people, we can't quite achieve that, particular level of quality that you're hoping for because of what you did. Right. Yeah.
It's kind of a hard thing to say, but it is, it is a regular everyday thing, and people, tend to understand what it is they're giving you and, what's realistic and what's not realistic. But again, like I maybe I'm a little bit of a dreamer about it, but, I always try and exhaust, every possibility. And, when people ask me to try and tweak stuff and get it closer to this or that, I mean, I'll try absolutely everything at my disposal. And, and I've
Let's talk
done
about,
a lot.
Let's talk about what you have at your disposal, because I know a lot of bedroom musicians just have like their plugins and their this and that. It's all done in the box, but you have like a lot of outboard gear, and like you were talking about your specially tuned room. So like what makes that kind of stuff more true to achieving the overall quality of the sound versus just using software?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, depending on, again, it always comes back to the individual who's actually doing the work, because, there's more than a few, very talented people in even in the mastering business, which, tends to focus more on analog outboard processing. That's sort of, the thing that, I used to say sells tickets. Mm-hmm. If you're a mastering engineer, you got to have this trinket or that toy on your gear list, or else people aren't going to take you seriously. But that's not really the case anymore, because digital technology has come a long way. It has gotten a lot better, and there are more than a few, very well-respected, renowned mastering engineers that are very open about the fact that they work mostly in the box now. So, it takes a long time to develop the chops to be able to do that, and get to a similar result than you can with, lots of fancy outboard analog stuff. But,
and is that a consequence? Is that a consequence of how people are consuming music now, like on just like iPhone speakers, and they're not listening in like high-end, like hi-fi audiophile systems like they used to be? Or
I mean, I think that I don't think they're really, anyone is cutting corners by staying in the computer when they're doing audio work or mastering. But it does streamline the process a little bit. I mean, for me personally, like I said, everyone works a little differently. But for me personally, if I were to work all in the box, it would probably cut, the amount of time I spend doing my job in half, because you're essentially eliminating, writing down notes on all of your, analog settings for every song. And I mean, there are more automated ways to do that now. There's sort of software that you could use to kind of record settings on analog hardware and sort of save them as a file. But, I don't know, maybe I'm getting older and I'm just real old school, but I like to have a physical, notebook that's filled with a bunch of kind of chicken scratch, notes, setting notes. And I have, literally,
and that's
what's that?
I was going to say, and that stuff's like real important too. Like the outboard gear and the analog stuff, especially when you're talking about like vinyl pre-masters and stuff. And I was wondering if we could go down that road in a little bit about, like what kind of role like you take in like sequencing because of the way different frequencies work physically on vinyl versus digital. And like, I think like when I think of like really, I mean, you're the guy, full disclosure, Dan has mastered some Red Hot Rebellion stuff beautifully, and we use you because of the fact that you do so much cool stuff with vinyl. Even though even songs we're not releasing for vinyl, we want your taste and your kind of expertise on that. So I guess could we talk a little bit about like the differences of like mastering for digital versus vinyl?
Absolutely, sure. And
I know that was a big tree to go around
words.
to get to that question, but sorry.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a little bit of a different approach. It is and it isn't, I guess, is the easiest way to describe it. But I mean, basically when you're preparing something for vinyl, the biggest difference that I talk to my clients about, is that, you don't necessarily need to go for the throat as far as volume,
Right.
when you're preparing masters for vinyl, because vinyl side lengths are a much bigger determining factor in, how loud your vinyl record is going to be cut. And again, this all goes, back to cutting engineers who actually do this stuff, who actually cut lacquer masters. I mean, they're the real experts on this, but in, the many, many years I've done this and, many people that I've worked with that are very, renowned kind of vinyl mastering engineers, who cut vinyl, lacquer masters, have sort of coached me into a process that, gets consistently good results. So, so basically, I mean, that's the big thing for me is, to encourage my clients to sort of, let's run kind of a separate pass of everything and, back off on the limiting, the digital limiting and, not really go for, into a territory where we're compromising the sound quality,
Because doesn't a lot of bass will make the needle skip and stuff, and depending on where it is in the either outer or inner in the platter or something? Is that how that works?
Yeah, I mean, again, you can have as much bass as you want, but it just needs to sound good and it needs to be balanced, with basically within the context of the recording that you're talking about, so you don't really have to back off of bass to cut a successful vinyl record. I mean, that's sort of, basically one of the myths that is out there that, got to be careful about your bass.
Yeah.
But again, it's all relative to the side length. If you have a really bassy record that has a 25-minute side, you're just going to have to expect that you're going to have a pretty quiet record. I mean, that's just the way it's got to be. And they're just limitations of the format that, kind of impose realities on us as engineers that, we just sort of have to do the best we can. And if people want their record louder, we need to talk about, their vinyl record, that is, we need to talk about maybe, cutting a song if they're kind of their side of their record is getting into the 20-minute plus territory. Maybe we got to resequence for vinyl. Maybe we've got to cut a couple of songs to get this sort of down, to closer to 18 minutes so you can get the volume you're after. I mean, it's all communication is key, and it just comes down to, again, understanding the limitations of the format.
Right.
And there are limitations, but if you do everything right, you keep your side lengths 20 minutes or less. 18 is ideal, but around 20 minutes is still fine. Bass in general is really not a problem, but if you start to get into stereo bass, that's where you sort of get into tricky territory. Again, stereo bass can be cut to vinyl. I mean, that's another sort of broad generalization that people make is they tell you, you cannot cut stereo bass to vinyl, which is not true. But again, it comes down to every situation is different. Every record is different. And, it's really about communication. And, I'm going to tell my clients, like, if there's an issue, like your bass is funky, or, you have some out of phase bass in this song, it'd be better for vinyl, since vinyl is such a, sort of critical part of this project, critical aspects that you're really, want to maximize the potential of. Maybe we should remix this song and just kind of have the bass coming up the center, and that'll save us some trouble. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When it comes time to cut the vinyl. So, it's always different. It's all over the map, but, communication is key, and understanding sort of the general technical stuff about vinyl. I think it's way overblown. I think everyone's like afraid, like, oh, vinyl, we got to,
yeah.
we've got to start over
It's
now
so
because we're doing
finicky.
vinyl. But
yeah. Well, I mean, I
Yeah.
guess that's like one of the things that you offer as, why your service is so important, because you have the expertise and the experience with all this stuff. So that's
Right.
yeah, and that was why I was kind of excited to talk to you about this, because there are so many myths about mastering, and we got to dispel those myths, people. So how long have you been?
There are many nuances, I
Yeah.
think is the word, really, because I mean, a lot of people make, like I said, there are a lot of broad generalizations that are out in the ether about, mastering or whatever, any aspect of production. And, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. And,
right.
Most of the time it's really not sort of a blanket, rule that you can't do this or that. It just really depends. Situations are unique, and, sometimes, you just have to take every project as, for what it is, and that's it. That's basically that's my broad generalization. Is absolutely every project is a little bit different and requires a little bit of a different discipline. So,
how long have you been a mastering engineer, and did you go to school for it, or are you self-taught, apprenticeship? What'd you do to get there?
I say I'm primarily self-taught. But yeah, it's weird. It's a weird thing. I mean, I started out, it's probably, the common tale of, starting out recording bands, in a basement. My friends bought like a, affordable Pro Tools rig, about 15 years ago, and, started kind of, convincing bands to give us a chance to record them. And one thing leads to another, and several years later, as it happened, I was learning about what mastering was, and started taking my engineering work, my mixing work and tracking work to Alan Douches, who's a mastering engineer at West Side Music, and really legendary engineer that mastered pretty much any, every CD that I had when I was 23 or 24 years old. And So, I just basically got interested in mastering because of Alan's influence. I mean, I had such huge amount of respect for what he did, and was really intrigued by it, and probably felt, similar to what you're describing, which was, what is this really mysterious process? What's this black magic that this guy is doing?
Yeah, exactly.
To kind of get records to sound that way and get them that loud and get them that, exciting. So, long story short, eventually Alan and me sort of, developed a good rapport, and ended up living in the same town as his studio, and basically, asked him if I could work there. And I guess that was around 2006 or 7. And yeah, I just kind of, started working with him and started to learn the ropes, and was scared to death of it for the first couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. I mean,
well, were you working with
Alan,
like some
Alan
heroes
is,
of yours? I mean, obviously Alan was a kind of a mastering hero, but did you work on bands that like you grew up listening to and are like, holy crap, now I'm working on their record? Or
I mean, there was some trial by fire for sure.
Yeah.
There was, I remember doing an Earth Crisis reissue.
Oh, cool.
One of the first things I ever mastered there, which was pretty intense. And there was, and then another really important person in my sort of career trajectory was Jay Robbins, who, I guess of Jawbox fame, the 90s Discord band. And so he was sort of my, a producer that I really idolized at the time. I mean, he was kind of making all of, my favorite records in the late 90s. He was producing and mixing a lot of that stuff. And so I sort of ran into Jay by being at West Side with Alan. And the real scary event that sort of, unleashed it all for me was Jay actually giving me a project to master for him. And that was completely just freaky. And,
Yeah.
I remember, I was pretty panicked about it. And I think, Alan sort of, he sort of consulted me throughout the project, and we got out, we got out of it alive, and it went fine. But I was like, what am I doing mastering a record that Jay Robbins, mixed? Like, I have no business doing this. And funny enough, eventually I started working a lot with Jay, years later, after I sort of finally, kind of felt more comfortable as a mastering guy. And now, fast forward to now, and we've probably done, over 100 projects together in the last 5 years. So that's amazing, how that all kind of went down. But yeah, I sort of just learned, the ropes there, working with Alan, watching him, and then, running for my life eventually, because I was like, there's no way I can do this, like, there's just too much pressure. There's too much responsibility with, the buck stops with me. And I just, I didn't feel like I knew enough technically and just wasn't comfortable. And I sort of ran for the hills at a certain point. And then oddly enough, the little bit of a discography that I did, sort of establish while I was at West Side for a brief time, kind of followed me after I left there, and I kept getting calls, about mastering. So eventually, I said, well, I guess this is just the way it's going to go.
I guess I'm a mastering engineer now. That's awesome.
Yeah, nobody wanted me to, track or produce or mix their stuff. They just, if I got a call, it was, Dan, can you master my record? So eventually I just, I bit the bullet, and I kind of scraped together what money I could, and bought a Manley compressor, a Varimute compressor, and kind of built my quote unquote empire from there. It's just, that's the way it went.
The records that you've worked on, I don't know a fraction of them, but I mean, I'm a big fan of Clutch and The Sword, and I think that's how I originally got introduced to your work. And like, there is, obviously each band has a different sound, but I think everything that I've heard come through your studio just sounds so damn good. So I don't know if it's,
thank you.
I mean, yeah, you are welcome, including, the Red Hot Rebellion stuff plug, that you've done. But, I wanted to ask, about like your background, like as a musician. Were you in bands, like when you were talking about at the start, when you were tracking your friends' bands and stuff, were you in those bands as well? And do you still play if you are a musician?
Yeah, I mean, I was a guitar player for, I guess, a songwriter, guitar player, singer for sort of a 90s kind of post-punk, emo-y sort of band called Joshua. And we made a few records, and, we got to kind of rub elbows with some pretty big bands of the time. But
did you tour with Jawbreaker at some point? Did you ever come to Florida?
No, we didn't tour with Jawbreaker. We played a little bit with Jets to Brazil, who were Blake's band after Jawbreaker. But yeah, we were just sort of one of those kind of undercard bands that just never quite got over the hump, so to speak. And we played support for the Get Up Kids and at the drive-in, and we were knocking at the door, so to speak, and just never quite climbed to the level of our peers.
And now you're working on
aforementioned peers.
The records, like you're working on
right. My consolation prize, right?
Yeah. But that's awesome.
It is weird. It's sort of I'm right where I should be, because I am pretty strongly kind of grounded in the scene where, bands are playing the kind of music that I used to play. Like a lot of bands I work with now, I the big part of the reason why they come to me, I'm sure, is because, I understand exactly what they're doing musically.
Right,
But it's not just limited to that, because I've always just been sort of a music fan. And that was sort of one of the hurdles I had as a musician, is that, I just love so many different kinds of music and was influenced by so many different kinds of bands or songwriters, that I just sort of, maybe, never kind of locked into a common, sort of a connecting thread of work, or, a sound that was really identifiable, because I was always kind of shifting my focus, and being influenced by this or that, and saying, well, maybe it's time to, write songs that sound a little bit more like this vibe or that vibe. So I think when our band started out, early on, we were doing something very different from what we eventually ended up doing at the end, which was sort of a much more kind of experimental, melodic sort of thing, as opposed to more of an aggressive, almost a hardcore sort of sound, which is where we started. So it suits me, because, I love, just kind of listening to Stevie Wonder, and then, just kind of maybe
and going and mixing War on Women or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
I said mixing. Damn it. You're a mess. Does anyone ever send you like the mix and say like, hey, our mixing guy, it can't get this quite right. Can you mix it and master it for us? Has that ever happened, or is?
Yeah, I used to do a lot more of that than I do now. I kind of have to decline when that question is posed nowadays, because, the mastering calendar just stays so full that, it's really hard. I wish I could, because it's so much fun. I miss mixing records. It's definitely something I really love to do, but, I'd be the first to admit that I'm probably not that great at it. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
But, I have a very kind of organic approach to, kind of sonic treatment. So, I think that was one of the big things that, a lot of the feedback I used to get when I mixed stuff, and this is really before I knew anything. I really didn't know anything when I was mixing. Now, with what I know now, I realize that I was absolutely just shooting in the dark. But, I tended to, stay very true to the source that was given to me, and try and honor, sort of the sound that was captured, and try and highlight, the performance, the natural performance. I wasn't big on sort of quantizing drums and, cleaning things up and doing tons of edits or anything. And, even as a tracking engineer, I would kind of let stuff slide. If something was a little wonky, it wouldn't really bother me very much, because, it felt human, it felt natural, it felt real. And that's always been my sort of the way I hear things. And, that translates really well to mastering, because, that's sort of, being objective, doing no harm, just sort of doing just what's needed to sort of bring it up to a certain, standard or benchmark, is kind of, a pretty good description of the job. So I think it all just kind of worked out the way it was supposed to, even though, I'll bet a lot of mastering guys you talk to were once had starry eyes of being a producer, or mix engineer, or, crystal lord algae or something. But it just doesn't go that way for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So is there like a mastering engineer Hippocratic oath to do no harm to the sound recording? Is that?
That's what they say. Yeah. You'll hear that repeated a lot. When you talk to mastering folk, but, you really, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, sometimes you'll get yelled at because you didn't do enough. And, sometimes people will complain because you changed something that they didn't want changed, but it's all part of the job. And, you can't play it halfway. You just have to do what you do and what you feel and what you think is the right thing to do. And that's kind of what people are paying you for. And, not everyone is not going to match up perfectly. There are going to be times when, people hear things a little differently than you do. And, maybe it's just a little bit more work to get it to the end result that everybody's after. But, most of the time, objectivity, and kind of neutrality is a good place to start, because, you have to respect what comes in, and you have to say, if this is the approved, mix, somebody really likes it. I mean, they have to, right?
Yes, somebody.
Or,
right.
you know,
wouldn't have wound up
this
there.
wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, you know,
yeah.
there are also instances where people just kind of give you a disclaimer, like, all right, you know, I blew it. Like, this mix is a mess, you know, so
Try to
you're going
fix
to have to really get in there, get in the weeds and just make it work. And, you know, that kind of statement up front is always helpful. You know, it's good to know, you know, when someone's direct and just asks you to save their butt. I mean, that's better than kind of doing 2 or 3 passes at something and then finally everybody kind of comes clean, you know. Okay, you know, it sounds like you're holding back a little bit for whatever reason, and we really just want you to get in there and fix that. So, so yeah, being direct is good. You know, that's always a welcome kind of aspect of, you know, of any client. And I try to do the same in return, because you're not doing anybody any favors by, you know, trying not to hurt their feelings if something is really wrong.
Time. Yeah, exactly.
Pretty much.
Are we still in the midst of the loudness wars, or is that kind of calmed down? Because I know for a while everyone's like, my mix has to be louder than this guy and that guy, and then louder. And then have we reached the limit? Is it the limit of the brick wall limiter?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, 0 is still 0 in digital. 0. You know, the ceiling is still the ceiling, but people will always try and find new ways to, you know, squeeze as much extra level out of anything that they possibly can. I mean, you know, it's really, again, it comes down to client to client. It varies. I mean, you know, people still obviously want a loud record if they can have one and not kind of give up, you know, everything that they worked for before the mastering began. And, you know, that's kind of the big trick of the job, is to sort of get it as loud as possible, but make it feel like it hasn't been, you know, squashed or processed or, you know, heavily
kind of like microchips.
Yeah, right. Hasn't been ravaged in the process of getting it to the level that it's at. It really, you know, that's the thing that we aspire to every day. And, you know, for me, it's kind of not a big part of my clientele. Like, there's not a whole lot of the kind of, you know, the kind of people I'm working with. They're really just either trying to make the best sounding record that they can, or, you know, they're just not that concerned with loudness over quality. They'll pick quality every time, you know, and those are the people I want to work with anyway. But there are, you know, there are the occasional folks that are still kind of hung up on the loudest thing. And it's funny because, you know, now streaming is such a big deal, with the way that everyone's listening. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the streaming world that discourages loud mastering, because, you know, they're all sort of applying their own gain changes, depending on the service. They're applying gain changes to the audio.
Kind of like a radio station will keep the one track to the next, keeping it at a consistent volume, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's, you know, we call it normalization, and, you know, every service, you know, has a little bit of a different spec. So it's very hard to hit the target, you know, with the streaming services, and YouTube has a different spec, you know, than Spotify, and Apple Music has a different spec than the two of those services have. And so it's really kind of a weird time where, you know, we're sort of chasing our tail right now in the mastering world, because, you know, people are, you know, not often, but I have had 1 or 2, you know, clients come back to me, you know, in the last 6 months or a year and say, hey, you know, my song is not as loud on Spotify as, you know, Britney Spears or something like that. And, you know, it's sort of, it's not, you know, what we're essentially telling them is, you know, by turning the master down, we might actually get closer. And it's very hard for people to process that. Like, they don't understand how that makes sense. And so it's kind of a challenging time to sort of, you know, properly educate folks and, you know, get them to embrace, you know, the concept of kind of backing off a little bit. And that's going to actually make them more competitive sounding in the streaming universe.
That's
and
interesting.
If they're doing a CD, you know.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about, though. That's nuts. But well, then okay. Let's do like a production meeting between me and you right now. So like this, this Red Hot Rebellion is going to release one song now and then either an EP or an album down the road. So I'm going to be giving you a finished mix that is primarily going to be released digital and streaming first, and then might wind up on a different medium, whether it's vinyl or CD. So what should we do then to prepare that mix for you? And then what will you do given all that information of how we're going to release it initially and then maybe in the future?
Well, in a perfect world, what would happen is, you would obviously prepare a mix that is pretty much the same procedure as you would normally use to prepare a good sounding mix. Mm-hmm. Nothing really would have to change other than that. There's even more reinforcement for not, slamming the mix before the mastering. So you really don't have to use, a lot of limiting and try and squeeze a lot of loudness out of the mix before it comes to me, because now with these additional considerations, with streaming, normalization, et cetera, we really want to preserve quality at every step as best we can. So just do a great mix. Don't worry about, putting limiters across the mix or making it loud. Let me sort of deal with, let me deal with the loudness part. And what I would say is what I typically tell people, because, people will generally freak out when they realize, there's all these different targets and they're still mastered for iTunes. And what do we do? Do we have to have 5 different masters for every song?
That was going to be my question. Do I need a master for iTunes? Do I need one for Spotify? Do I need one that might go on a 7-inch versus a 33 1/3 RPM full length? I'm freaking out. Talk me down, Dan. Talk me down.
Yeah, I mean, typically what I find, and again, this goes back to kind of, it kind of comes back to you. It's kind of like, well, what do you want out of this, project? Do you want the, sort of iTunes release to be really loud and in your face? You want to make sure that you're not compromising on level, in that world, or maybe eventually you're going to release a CD of all these songs that you're planning to sort of release monthly at this point. So I would say there's really only a need for 2 masters, and that's typically what I tell clients, because, I don't want to nickel and dime and charge, extra money for all these different versions. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't want to take the time to have to prepare all these different versions.
Right. Yeah.
Because I don't have time for that.
Right.
So, like I said, I mean, I'm typically not really squashing stuff very hard anyway. I mean, it's just not the way that I do this job. I really don't slam things for loudness. I've done records that are plenty loud that, survive the loudness normalization across platforms perfectly fine. But what I typically tell people is, let's do one alternate version with the peak limiting kind of backed off. And that's the final limiting that basically determines, the absolute maximum level of the master. Mm-hmm. And, let's kind of temper that down a little bit, and let's leave a little bit more headroom on the final output of the file. So in other words, when we're trying to get these really loud masters, we're basically using absolutely every, sort of value of volume in the available scale in the digital domain. So, we're printing masters to a final output of minus 1/10 of a decibel until it just distorts and explodes. So, so basically, if we just kind of temper that back and leave a full decibel of final, headroom beyond the final peak, the output level of the master, and then we also temper the limiting back a little bit, then we're going to be hitting these streaming targets pretty much dead on. So there's this is twofold, how this benefits us. And that's that we're hitting the streaming targets, so they're not turning the master down. So that's great, because it's going to be just as competitive as anything else in the services. And then the second good thing about that is now we've backed off, this really kind of aggressive limiting process that we use to kind of maximize level on CD. But now that we've backed it down, we've kind of gotten a little bit of dynamic range back. We've gotten a little bit more kind of clarity in the transients, a little bit more punch in the drums, if that's the kind of track we're talking about. Just a little more space, a little less harsh a little less crispiness. You know what I mean?
Yeah. More musicality.
And that all translates really well.
Yeah. I was going to say that adds a little more musicality and a little more.
Yeah,
absolutely. Makes it more musical.
It adds.
Yeah,
more. It's more musical, and it has a little bit more depth and space, and it just plain old sounds better.
Right. Yeah.
You know, we don't need to use lots of adjectives, and we don't need to get technical. It just plain sounds better because we just really care about what regular people think, about listening to music, because, we can have a big party all day long that, we got the loudest record on Spotify, and that's great. But if nobody likes it and nobody wants to listen to it because it hurts their head after song 3, then, we really haven't accomplished anything. So, it just plain old sounds better to the folks that are actually going to be streaming music on these services. And, they won't be provoked to turn something off. And if something is mastered really hot and just really starved of dynamic range because of the aggressive limiting that I was talking about, it's really just, it's going to sound very, very small and very kind of, insignificant on a streaming service that's turning it down 6 or 7 decibels, just so that, it meets their kind of loudness normalization sort of spec and plays back evenly in perceived level with everything else on Spotify or Apple Music and the like. So, so we're winning in 2 ways, and it's great. And, obviously that takes a little bit of extra time in the mastering process. So, we try and sort of be fair and ask for a tiny bit more compensation for doing this, but, it's not a lot. And, if the client doesn't see the benefit in doing it and doesn't really want to do that, they just want to kind of stick with the traditional program, then we'll honor that. And that's fine. We're not forcing anybody to do anything that they don't want to do, but it's just more of, educating people to the reality of what's happening and, let them make the choice. And if they don't hear a difference, then,
so be it. Yeah.
So be it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's amazing. Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Where can people find you online and in the interwebs if there are clients out there that want to hire you for some awesome mastering sorcery?
You can find me at www.srmastering.com, and that's SR for Sunroom. And also there's Facebook, Sunroom Audio on Facebook. You could find me on Instagram, which is also listed as Sunroom Audio, but also my name, Dan Coutant. If you do a search, you'll track me down there, and lots of cool pictures of gear that I'll never pay off. And
yeah, that is some
occasionally
fancy
my dog
gear.
and
oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's all my Instagram is my dog, and then even the band Red Hot Rebellion's Instagram is loaded full of pictures of my dogs and stuff. So
yeah,
I get
dogs are essential for any artistic endeavor.
Yeah, exactly. Dogs make rock and roll go round. Well,
I
Dan,
agree.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and shed some light on mastering. If people have questions, they can find you online at srmastering.com. And Dan is a super nice fella, so reach out to him, please, folks. Dan, thanks again for taking the time to talk to us. And keep an eye out for those new Red Hot Rebellion tracks that are coming your way to make your ears bleed.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It was a lot of fun, and yeah, looking forward to the work.
All right, buddy. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So I guess that'll do it for this episode of Idiots with Instruments. I am Jim Tremontana, reminding you to keep it simple.
Hey, this is Blind Tone WJ. Stay hydrated, everybody.
And I'm Andres, letting you know to please not play acoustic, because it takes away jobs from drummers.
That's correct.
Yeah.
All right. Bye!
Idiots with Instruments is a Solid Arts and Science production. All rights reserved throughout the multiverse. Please subscribe and review the show on iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. Visit idiotswithinstruments.com for exclusive bonus material and to support or sponsor this show.